Excellent. Right. So come on in, everyone, and get settled. Here in New York, it is cold and rainy, so I hope it is warm where you are. This is why nothing good ever happens in New York, but here we are. We will get through it. I'm that cold. Yes. Questions. Awesome. So Ava, before I ask you questions, I always love to hear an author. I'm sorry, it's Ava, and I know that. Sorry, Ava. Um, I would love for you to read a bit of your novel. Are you up for that?
Sure. Yeah, I would love to.
Excellent. All right. Well, the floor is yours. And thank you
Okay.
so much for joining us at the Audacious Book Club.
I am so thrilled to be part of the Audacious Book Club, Roxane. You're someone I have looked up to and been inspired by for all these years, and I can't believe that I get to talk to you today. This is very special for me, so I really, really appreciate the opportunity.
Oh, of course.
I'm going to read the prologue, which is pretty short. A woman alone on the mountain at dusk. An invisible boot pressed against my throat, making my breath labored and helpless. And yet I couldn't go back and face my parents or my stifled future. Hidden behind a boulder, I hugged my knees and imagined my rage and pain whirling into a wildfire, burning down all the injustices. Could my father have known what was going on? I wanted to tell him, to share this burden with him. My shoulders were already heavy beneath the daily cruelties of living as a woman in Lanatawa, the damned place. This fatigue was incurable. The sun had sundered down, disappeared behind Lake Zrebar. A dozen shades of red burst open along the horizon. Below, the narrow, winding asphalt road was the hem around the hill's green skirt, embroidered with clusters of red and yellow wildflowers. The Schleer flowers stood elegant and tall, flourishing across the rough Kurdistan plateau, defying borders. I yearned to be a Schleer, but it was a garden of anguish, of loathing, of torment. My occupied homeland was a birthplace of death. I stood up, my breath now coming in pants. I wasn't hiding anymore. Bessa, Bess, I shouted, it's enough, enough. I started down the hill in a tumbling run and found myself unable to stop. Despite the chill of the evening, I started sweating. The wind whipped my headscarf and I gained speed. I flapped as if I had wings. As I ran, a wail escaped my chest. I was headed toward the main road, toward the world of men. The streets belonged to them, judgmental men, hypocritical men. Their honor depended on women, men. Cars hurtled around the curve, full of drunk drivers who honked as they spotted me sprinting down the hillside. They were going too fast for this road, too fast for their sluggish reflexes, and too fast for their old vehicles. A white late model car careened down the winding road, kicking up dust. The wind roared in my ears. The white car and whoever was driving seemed to seek me out as a fellow traveler. I stumbled on a stone, crushing the shiny red poppies in the grass. And as I lurched, my untold stories tumbled inside me like pages ripped from a book and tossed, crumpled into a waste paper bin. An overpowering urge to script my story, to expel it from beginning to end, seized me. Suddenly, I could see the heads of all those Kurds crushed beneath tanks. Descending the slope at a breakneck pace, my shouts crescendoing, I was unable to stop myself, this crazed woman. A final lunge, and I was airborne.
Thank you so much for sharing that prologue. One of the things that has struck me as I've read your book is the power that fiction can have to open our eyes and our minds to cultures that we may not be familiar with. And that was certainly one of the reasons I originally picked up your novel. And so I would love to know what inspired you to write Daughters of Smoke and Fire.
You're so right, Roxane. Reading is so unique in the sense that it connects us across centuries and continents. And I wanted to write this story because there's a reason people don't know about Kurds. It's not an, there are forces actively working to make sure we remain unknown. And the price that people nowadays pay for remaining unknown is really heavy. I mean, one of the reasons we all learned about what ISIS did when they emerged, but the reason of all the groups they attacked, they were able to commit genocide against a very specific religious minority, Yazidi minority, which is an ancient religion, pre-Abrahamic, that they could kidnap their women and kill all their men. While it was happening, it could have been broadcasted, it could have been stopped, but it wasn't. People didn't know who Yazidis were. And so the price this group paid for it was really huge. And so being born Kurdish, I always had to deal with this question: what does it mean that we have been targeted for genocide and cultural genocide? So physical erasure and cultural erasure repeatedly. And what does that mean to me? On one hand, it felt like just me being alive, just breathing, just saying, I am here, I'm a woman, I'm a Kurdish woman, was a victory in and of itself. And at the same time, it felt that it wasn't enough. So I knew I had a story that hasn't been told. Not that the world was willing to make a space for me and say, hey, please come over, tell us your story. But I felt that I had to write it. It's just one of those things that comes from the center of your soul. And you feel responsible to get it done.
How do you make a space for yourself, for your voice, for your ideas, for the stories you want to tell, particularly in a world where marginalized people are often told there is no space for you here?
That was another thing that I actually grappled with for a long time when I was ready to give up writing, because I started writing from a young age. I was a kid, and that was my way of orienting myself through the world, to make sense of the chaos unfolding around me. And so writing has been a part of me. But after I immigrated to Canada, I realized that, okay, now I live in this country where my stories aren't censored and no one holds a gun to my head for what I write. But that doesn't mean I get heard. And then I understood the hierarchy of whose voice gets heard. And so there was at least a year when I stopped writing. But then I realized there are people who refuse to give up writing. And I realized that even if the world doesn't make space for me, at least I grow through this writing. So I owe it to myself to continue doing this. Now that's a big decision and a challenging one, because obviously I needed to, work 70, 80 hours a week to pay the bills and survive as a newcomer in this country. And yet, carve a time for me to write. It's to this day, it's a challenge. But I feel like if I don't write, I have kind of betrayed myself. I have only gone through the motion of living, whereas for me, it's this inner life that's the most important thing, and my way of accessing it is through writing.
Writing is certainly the same for me. It always has been. It's been salvation, and it has allowed me to feel the most like myself. And it's interesting to hear that you feel that way about writing when, for Layla, filmmaking and telling stories in that way was her passion and the way she wanted to make her mark on the world. And so I'm curious, how much of yourself do you put into your characters, if any parts?
The plot is not really based on my life. There are little details here and there in the story that are inspired by my own experiences. For example, the experience of being a 6-year-old or 7-year-old and being told that now, because you're a girl, you have to hide your hair and cover your body and all of that. So I did obviously built on what I had gone through in my own life. But I also I also know how privileged I am as a Kurdish woman. I know it might sound ridiculous to an American audience, but I got into a good university. I got out of Iran on a student visa. And I thought, how many people have had this privilege? And so I wanted to write the story for other Kurdish women and say, it's still possible despite all the obstacles that you're facing. And maybe I was able to overcome some of them. It's still possible to find a meaningful life in this world and, carve a little corner for yourself and find your own little joys in it. And so it was obviously, my writing is about me, is about what I discover, but it's always been because of that huge responsibility of I belong to people who are known. It tends to be also about so much that's bigger than me. Also, my activism and journalism always exposed me to so many other lives. And because I am such a strong empath, it always felt like my own life in so many ways.
You are the first Kurdish woman to publish a novel in English, which is certainly an accomplishment, but I imagine it must also come with pressure and perhaps even frustration, because your novel was published, I believe, in 2021 or early 2022. And it took quite a long time. So I would love for you to talk a bit about the significance of what you've accomplished, but also some of the challenges that might come along with that.
So, Roxane, that only tells me how many other Kurdish women, much more talented than me, whose voices have been muffled, just because of their gender combined with their ethnicity. So it doesn't feel like an accomplishment as much as it feels like how lucky I was to get the voice out there, and how much I owe these other women whose voices were silenced. It certainly does with a lot of responsibility as well. But I know that I can only do so much as one individual, and I'm trying my best. And I know I am not going to exactly get and set out to do everything that I set out to do. And I just accept that with humility. What could I do? I'm trying my best.
And truly, I think our best is all we can do. And so we always just hope that our best will be enough. English is your third language after Kurdish and Persian. So what is the process for you of writing in English? Do you think first in Kurdish and then translate it for yourself, or do you write directly into English? I would love to know your approach.
It has changed over the years. Kurdish is a language that it was the first language I spoke. It was the language of home, of affection, of connection to community. But from first grade, I started getting distance from the language because I never learned to read and write in that language. So I learned Persian, I learned literacy and Persian language pretty much at the same time. And that was a lot of pressure for me to just understand this language and connect with it. And it just created with me and a lot of millions of other Kurdish kids this cognitive dissonance between generations, where you can't connect with your grandparents who didn't go to school and didn't learn Persian, and now they're reading and writing in another language, and you can't read and write in the language that tells you about your history, your culture, and all of that. So there's some kind of crack inside your psyche when you can't read and write in your mother tongue. It creates a shell of a human in you. So I embraced Persian. It was the language of education, of prosperity, and I loved Persian literature. Is also really rich. Gave me access to read Rumi and Hafiz in the original language. And then when I went to Canada when I was 24, 25, I started teaching myself my mother tongue and learning my own history, which felt like claiming everything that I'd been denied. So the reason I decided to write in English was because my Kurdish wasn't good enough to write, to create literary work in it. My Farsi was good enough, but that was the language of my direct oppressor. And here was English, the language of colonizers, people who were initially responsible for all the pain. But if I wanted to, I needed to connect to people who had some openness and some curiosity about untold cultures and untold stories. And so I thought I could either dedicate my energy to improve my Kurdish or to English, and I opted for English. I also majored in English, and so I love the language. I love how this language opened my access to a whole new world. You know, where I grew up, Roxane, on this border between Iran and Iraq. There was no internet. My only way of accessing beyond what my senses could perceive were books. So books were really, really important for me. They were the only window outside of this limited world. And so today, though, that was almost 15, 16 years ago when I made that decision. Today, I'm more comfortable in English. I start thinking in English. And when you write, you don't have an accent. That's the good thing. You feel like this is a natural thing you can do. Yeah.
What were some of those books that were windows into the world for you growing up?
Anne Shirley was my favorite fictional character as a young kid. Just the way she could find joy despite, you know, being an orphan, was very inspiring. It was good to know that joy was possible, because I looked around me and all I saw was grief and oppression. Definitely, Colin. How can I mess up his name right now? But Catcher in the Rye.
Yes, Holden Caulfield.
Holden Caulfield, yeah. His journey was very inspiring to me when he talks to his English teacher, and the English teacher said, the mark of a mature person is that they live for a cause, whereas the mark of an immature person is that they die for a cause. Resonated deeply with me, because I come from this background where the right to live is not given, you have to fight for it. And so a lot of our young people had to opt for that, picking up the gun instead of a pen, just because there was no other option. And be willing to be a Peshmerga, to be the first person who faces death, is very strong in the Kurdish culture. And so that gave me permission to live for a cause as opposed to die for a cause. And it's also near the end of the same novel that the teacher says, you're not alone. There are people who have come before you and have felt all this burden and this existential loneliness that you're feeling, and you can connect with them through books. And so it was good. I saved me from this deep sense of loneliness and not belonging, even where I was born into.
Yes, you know, that must be something that's really hard to communicate the reality of, to be born into a culture where you only know oppression and you have to look for these windows outward. So how do you find that motivation to choose to live to fight and to use storytelling as one of those means of not giving up?
Well, it's if I feel like I don't have a choice. In so many ways, it feels like if I want, you know, it's either life is worth living, and if I decide that I want to live, I don't want to be a walking dead. I want to have that inner life. And there are these moments when all these layers of grief go away. It's like I am finally undressed naked when I'm in nature, when I hike for several hours, that I have this moment when something lifts up from my shoulder, and then I'm joy. I see that what I am is joy. I don't have to go grab for it or find it. It's within me. I just need to give myself that moment of connecting to real me.
For those of you who are here listening to this wonderful conversation, if you have questions for Ava, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and you can ask your questions there. Ava, you dedicated this book in part to Farzad Kamangar, and in your author's note, you call him your teacher, and you say that even though you never met, he shifted something fundamental within you. What did Kamangar mean to you, and why was his life so important, not only to your novel, but to Kurdish culture?
I can definitely say he was important to me. I don't know if he was important definitely to Kurdish culture. He was one of the many figures that inspired a lot of people. But the reason he basically saved me from this moment. You know, your previous question is very much weaves into this other question of so of course I have read about Nelson Mandela and Gandhi and Martin Luther King and all these larger than life people who were able to hang on to their sense of hope and humanity despite every force that worked against them. And it was good to know these people existed, but I was never able to identify with them. Farzad was almost my age, a few years older than me. He was Kurdish. He was put in a jail, this notorious prison in Iran, in Evin, and he was tortured repeatedly because of his ethnicity, because he had a Kurdish accent, because he was teaching his mother tongue to these kids. And yet, when he wrote letters from prison, his writing was different from other people because he was still full of hope and life and joy. So I thought, how is this possible? Because it's so easy to give into disappointment, to feel disillusioned, to have a lot of self-pity, which is something Toni Morrison also talks about, right? That we can't afford it. We speak, we write, we make language. That's how civilization heals. So with Farzad, when I saw someone coming, well, he was still a man, but he was the closest thing to my culture that I could see. He was able to still love and not hate, you know, despite everything. And I thought, well, if he can do it, maybe I can too.
Mhm.
And I came across him at that moment when I had decided that, okay, I'm an immigrant, I need to survive, I need to, you know, serve, wait tables, and I can't write, I can't read anymore. Maybe I should put my dreams of writing aside. And then he wrote in prison with broken bones, and I thought, if he can find it in himself to write, then I should definitely do the same.
You also dedicate this book to Kurdish women, and I'm curious, what do you most want Kurdish readers who will read your novel to take from this story and how you've told it?
So the Kurdish women live on this extremely huge spectrum. Like, for example, look at when ISIS emerged.
Uh-huh.
Who's the first woman that they took as slaves? Kurdish women. But who defeated ISIS? Who fought ISIS? Kurdish women. How can we both be the slaves and the saviors? And, you know, within the context of Iran, where I come from, we have really high rates of suicide. And I understand what that means to come to a moment when you feel like your life isn't worth living. But I also work with activists who are risking their lives to help these other women. So that spectrum of someone saying, so many of us thinking, I'm not gonna continue living. And so many of us saying, wait, life is still worth living. Let me show you how. I also went through a similar thing. And so that spectrum, that wide range is, to me, is very unique. And I think it happens when the oppression is extreme, that you have these both groups of women. So I wanted to tell other Kurdish women, I see you. I know how painful it is to deal with these all layers of oppression, from state chauvinism to male chauvinism to war to poverty to all sorts of deprivation. All these forces that are trying to erase you are you're working against, but it's possible. Let's help each other out.
Mhm.
Life might still be worth living. Hang on a little bit longer.
Mhm. You've recently written in publications from Monterey County Weekly to the Toronto Star about the current protests in Iran. Can you talk to us a bit about how the landscape has changed for women in Iran in the past few decades? And Why is this moment significant, and why have these protests sustained themselves for this long?
So I don't know how to answer that question briefly. It's been 43 years in making, right? The Iranians have been struggling for democracy for a long time. And in 1979, when the big revolution happened, the supreme leader, Ruhollah Khomeini, he was supposed to be just the face of the revolution and sit back and allow the country to be ruled by democratic means. And that was not his plan. He started executing opposition, and Kurds were attacked. Kurds were the first group that opposed this government from the beginning. Fast forward 43 years from that time when a revolution was hijacked. So much has changed internally, despite the propaganda of the government to present women as threats and ethnic minorities as threat. And that's such an important strategy, because when a group are presented as threats, no one is willing to open up to them, right? Because they're afraid of them. And the idea always was women's freedom is going to destroy your society, and Kurdish freedom would be a threat to your territorial integrity. And there were at least 2 generations who failed to stand up to it. Even if they didn't agree with it, they failed to stand up to it. And now we have Gen Z who are really shifting the dialogue. We see these young men chanting in support of young women. We see different ethnic groups chanting in support of each other, because Iran is a very diverse country in reality, but it only has a homogeneous representation, right? So there has been huge suppression. So it is a very important moment in history when finally people of diverse backgrounds said that we do not want to accept this oppressive government anymore. That was a good start, and that has started shifting things. But then how do you deal with a government that doesn't hesitate to kill and has such a massive military power? How can you peacefully get rid of a government like that? So that has been a question that we've been working with for the past 3 months.
That seems like a question for which there is no easy answer. And I don't know that bringing about sustainable change in Iran, it has an easy answer. Where do the protests go from here? And how can those of us in other countries who are paying attention but are not experts in the area, how can we best support these protests?
Well, first of all, thank you for paying attention. That's very important. When people do keep an eye on this and talk about this and write to the representatives about this, that is more helpful than you think. Just posting about the Iranian women, talking about them is going to help them. Iranian government continues this double policy of trying to tell the rest of the world that we're okay, we're working with our people, maybe we even abolish morality police, whereas in reality they double down suppression and they have started executing all these protesters. So to your first question, where is this going from here? That's a very difficult question to answer. No one can really predict. The hope is that for the government to leave, escape, go elsewhere, and let people decide for their future. But at what point would they be willing to do this? Is the big question, because the reason they have survived for 43 years is because of how extremely brutal this regime is, right? To your second question of how can we support, there is really a lot that you can do. So it's really the policymakers, if they hear from their people. I know representatives don't tend to answer people's email. They take months and they send a form letter, but it really counts how many emails and phone calls goes to their offices and says, how are you supporting these people? And then in terms of asking for direct policy changes, for example, here in Canada, in California, we can put pressure on these big tech companies to help people in Iran circumvent the internet blockage that has been a great problem over there. Elon Musk made this big claim about the Starlink, but Starlink would only work if there are already towers in the country, and there is no such a thing in Iran. So people don't have access to, a lot of protesters are injured now, and the pharmacies are banned from selling them, first aid kits. So through Doctors Without Border, through Red Cross, Red Crescent, you can send assistance and help for these people. You can donate to human rights organization. Certainly reading a book like that, or that talks about the reality of being a woman in Iran, is very eye-opening, because media can only give you this much, and people need to understand what is actually happening. Who are these people who are no longer afraid of bullets? What makes a human no longer be afraid of bullets? And so through arts, through literature, there are these ways of connecting with each other, because really Iranian women's victory is victory for women everywhere. And especially with today in US, with all these rulings, and things seem to be going backward. And so this supporting other women's cause can help.
Absolutely. When you look at what's happening to women in Iran and here in the United States and countries around the world, we may be different, but we are dealing with a lot of the same challenges. One of the most interesting threads early in your novel is the significance of these characters' names. Can you tell us a bit about why you chose the names that you did, particularly given the challenges of naming for Kurdish people, where you have to really have two names, your true name and the name that you carry with you when you go out into the world?
Oh, I'm so glad you know that, Roxane. It's true that Mahsa Amini's name, that is widely known internationally, is not the name that her mother calls out at her funeral. And I think the least you can do for that mother is to honor the daughter's real name, Gina. And then this ethnic oppression that doesn't allow people to choose the names that they want, and a government that even interferes in the name you pick for your own child. When picking name for characters, I was trying to find names that would represent the culture, so it would be true to the culture, but also names that would be pronounceable for the reader. For example, the name Alan in Kurdish, which means flag bearer, sounds very much like Alan, but it's not Alan, it's Alan. And so making a conscious choice in clarifying how even names are banned, because Layla's name was supposed to be Nishman, but Nishman is homeland, and homeland is a name that's supposedly banned. So, and on the other hand, as a fiction writer, the name of your character is so important. Once you have their name, you can picture them, you can picture who you are. So I had to really work within a lot of limits with that. Or Schleer, the flower that is on the cover, is often pronounced as Schuyler, but I still had to put that name in there and try to clarify that it's a flower. If it's a flower that blooms across the borders, which in and out itself talks about how much a lot of Aboriginal people across the world don't respect borders. They're meaningless to us. We were living with our relatives and cousins, and one day Brits and France showed up and said, oh, by the way, this side that where your cousin lives is now Turkey, and that side is now Syria, and this side. And so I actually paid attention to those names. What name could represent defying border? What name could be also show the nature of Kurdistan and all of that?
Well, it came through, and it made for very compelling reading. So much of the early part of the novel really details the familial relationship between Layla and her brother Chia and her parents. And we see that really this is a family that has been shaped by trauma, because the father was imprisoned and tortured, and the mother's trying to hold everything together, and the children are trying to figure out how they can really find a way to thrive, to survive the world. What kinds of things were you thinking about when you developed this family dynamic, and why did you structure the novel so that we spend so much time with them early in the novel before you start to open up the world of the novel as Layla and Chia get older?
So on one hand, as you've talked about this yourself, on one hand, the reason I love literature, love fiction, is because it's a way of examining what's it like to experience being a human, right? To be a consciousness within a body, but at the same time, that experience is so much shaped by where you're born, what type of body you're born into, and how geopolitics defines your experience and limits your experience or expands your experience. So the question was, I am going to write about Kurds. 90% of my audience are going to be like, what is that? I've never even heard of that. And so when you haven't heard of a group of people, you're not curious about them. You don't necessarily open up to them. But I had to be true to that experience. I couldn't basically put a makeup on that experience. It had to be true and realistic. And at the same time, despite all those differences, there are some universal aspects to our experiences as human, the connection with our family or lack of connection to family, the way so many of families are actually dysfunctional, despite the best attempt and best intentions. So there was this, it still is, I haven't resolved this burden of education. I want to tell a story. I don't want to have to educate people. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there is no way I can tell the story of an unknown people without bringing in different elements of their life into the story. For example, the way Chia talks at age 15 doesn't at all sounds like what a typical 15-year-old in America talk, right? Mm-hmm. Because they haven't had to deal with what someone like Chia has dealt with. So that fine balance between authentic but also understandable, where do I make these two meet? Uh-huh. And I thought if I give enough legroom to the parents and their experience and the siblings relationship, I can build a foundation that later, when protests happen and imprisonment happen, and so my readers might have an easier time understanding why things are that way instead of starting with the protest and imprisonment. I wanted to build, give that time to readers to understand how trauma affects, generations.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a dilemma that a lot of underrepresented writers must grapple with, which is, how do I tell the story I want to tell while making sure that audiences can connect to it in some way without feeling like I have to prepare a textbook about my culture. I thought that you managed that balance very well, and I was particularly interested in the structure of the novel and the shifts in point of view, because the Layla sections are substantial and in first person, as is the Chia section. And then the Alan section is written in third person. Why did you decide to structure the novel in the way you did with those shifts in person and perspective?
I was interested in examining the type of trauma that you inherit that you don't firsthand experience. So I wrote Alan's exposure to that massacre first person and then third person, and then changed it to first person. But what I wanted to, because so many times when people even know a little bit about Kurds, all they know is the genocide, right? Mm-hmm. And I wanted a little bit of distance from that, just a little bit, just to see how things affect a generation like Layla and Chia, who didn't face what it's like when tanks run over people's head, but also have it in their body just because they were born with it. So I thought writing it in third person would give me that distance from firsthand physically experiencing genocide versus hearing about it. And Chia's chapter was really the first chapter that I wrote because I based Chia on Farzad Kamanga, the teacher we talked about, the person who inspired me. So I first wrote that chapter and I realized, wait a minute, despite everything, he's still a man. Let me try and examine Kurdish women's stories. So it's partly about how the story shaped itself and partly about my priorities to you know how when you talk to people in Rwanda, they say, we're more than our genocide. Let's look at other things. Let's
Mhm.
discuss other things. I think I kind of have a little bit of urge in that sense as well, because despite everything that Kurds have gone through, we have had a lot of gifts for the world.
Mhm.
For example, we have the most upbeat music in the entire region. And so much of Iranian music is indebted to Kurdish music. Just the color that women wear, the food that we represent and bring to the world, the philanthropists, the filmmakers. The reason I wanted Layla to be a filmmaker is because we have a lot of successful Kurdish filmmakers. They're not very well, they're not been given a space and a platform, but still they're the ones who have won a lot of indie film awards and stuff.
Mhm.
Yeah, so striving for that balance.
Mhm. And it is a tough balance when you know that there's more to your country's story or your people's story than just the most traumatic elements of it, but yet you can't tell a story without acknowledging that reality. We see a lot of how these things play out where people contain multitudes and cultures contain multitudes, particularly in your characterization of the women characters, such as Layla, Hannah, Shyler, and Joanna, who have this common history, but they're very individual. How did you think about these women in relation to one another? And what kinds of things did you want readers to take from these women and how they live their lives?
So a lot of my activism happened to fall on suicide prevention. Not that I wanted to, but I felt like I had to because no one else was doing it. And
Hmm.
as I got closer to creating this grassroots activism and creating workshops on suicide prevention, developing lesson plans or translating them mostly from Canada, where the Aboriginal kids also deal with a lot of suicide. And as I got closer and closer to the lives of these high schoolers and the teachers who were working with them, um, Roxane, I was so shocked by what a big role their mothers played in pushing these girls to the edge. And my initial response was a lot of rage, a lot of anger. What are you doing to another woman, to your own daughter? Um, and then I had this moment when I thought about, oh my God, if a person is oppressed and pushed and traumatized to the degree that they can be cruel to their children, maybe instead of being angry at them, I can have a little bit of compassion for them, especially in a country where mental health is not taught, mental illness is not diagnosed frequently. Um, and so people are very much alone with their struggles with mental illness. Um, and then I wanted Hannah to be struggling with narcissism, but I also wanted Layla to have someone in her life that's a little bit nurturing. So which is how I came up with Joanna. And I also put Joanna in contrast with the father's character because they were both in prison, they were both tortured, but um, Joanna didn't come out of it very bitter, whereas he did. So I wanted to show that woman's ability um, to go through all those horrific things, but come out of it stronger. Not well. She's broken. She suffers. She's traumatized. But at the same time, at least she doesn't project it upon other people.
Mhm.
Um, and then with Schler and Layla, I was trying to look at the different tools that they pick up to fight the fight they had to fight. One has to pick up the weapon, the other one picked up a camera, and Shia himself picked up a pen in that fight.
Throughout the novel, you reference some foreign books and illegal Western films. I chuckled when I saw Scent of a Woman referenced, that inspire some of Layla and Chia's revolutionary fervor. But I also noted and appreciated the references to Kurdish writing in film, like Simin Chaichi's poetry, the film Turtles Can Fly by Bahman Gobadi, The Blind Owl, and others. What made you choose these very specific pieces of writing and film to reference in the novel?
I really appreciate that you paid attention to it. One of the critics once wrote that this looks like an encyclopedia of Kurdish culture. And I was really happy for that. I wanted that balance. I wanted to say that we have had a lot of people with a lot of talent, whose talents were just mutilated. I guess that, again, going back to that, we're more than our pain, we're more than our suffering. I guess one of the reasons people turn a blind eye to what happens to the Kurds, because I think in so many ways the story of the Kurds, the statelessness and everything that has come with it, could really put humanity into shame. I mean, what kind of world do we create? What kind of insane world do we have that we have something like genocide in human society? I mean, who are we really? And at the same time, to show the certain, at least a group of artists' ability to bloom despite all of that horrible experiences. So it was important to me to write about all these women poets and novelists and filmmakers. I wanted the Western reference so I could connect with my English reading audience. And I wanted to honor and pay tribute to all these people who came before me and created powerful work.
What other Kurdish writers should we all be reading?
We're working on an anthology of Kurdish women's literature, looking for a home for it. Hopefully we will have a book in the next 2 years. A book was published in UK, which translated some of Kurdish women's poem specifically to English. It is called, there are two book published in Canada called Kurdish Women's Stories, and one published in the UK called Kurdish Women Poetry. Those are good references for the time being. And hopefully there will be more and more.
Yes. We have some questions from our audience, so I thought I would ask them. And if you are listening and do still have a question, please feel free to ask it. So Mickey asks, well, first she says, I didn't know I was thirsty for a book written by a Kurdish author until I read this book, my first. Like many immigrant stories about their birthplaces, this book read like a memoir. Was it painful to write this novel knowing these violent acts did occur to someone? Or was it cathartic because you were able to give voice to people who historically have been brutally silenced? Or was it maybe a combination of those things?
Thank you for that. Yeah, it was definitely a combination. It's still, what I try to do is to turn pain into poetry, into stories, and turn rejection into fuel. And so the pain is there, and it's the fuel that makes you want to write. And yet there is a sense of catharsis when someone reads it and understands it, and that connection happens. It's very rewarding in that sense. Yeah.
Someone asks, what windows do you hope your writing can open to the Kurdish women and young girls who are still being oppressed? And also, thank you for writing this powerful, moving novel and for sharing your story with us tonight.
Thanks. I think I want Kurdish women to know that despite all the politics that has denied us, defined us wrongly, and has tried to erase us, there are people in the world who know you and see you and care about you. And because I've talked to a lot of people who have attempted suicide and people who have been in prison, and they say the worst thing, worse than what they're going through, is the idea of being unknown and no one knows about them and no one cares about them. I think as humans, we're all starved for connection, and this is a form of connection for them to know that someone knows that they exist and they're struggling, and cheers for them and hopes that they will be successful eventually.
Someone else asks, how can people, in particular women who have a fractured relationship with older generations, but who inherit this intergenerational trauma, find acceptance of their ancestral culture while searching for purpose in their lives and working to build a future where their voices matter? I mean, that's a huge question.
Huge question.
What are some of your thoughts?
Well, I think for me, at least, I can share my experience. It was important for me to, at one point, to realize that my ancestors didn't just give passed down pain; they also gave me a lot of strength. And the reason that I am resilient and I continue to write and continue to fight is because they did the same thing in different forms. But I think it was important for me to acknowledge um, the gifts that they've given me, that it's not just their pain and trauma that they passed down, and that in and of itself creates a sort of balance, to have empathy instead of judgment for my ancestors, and to try and use the Kurdish story and Kurdish pain as a way to connect to other people. I've been so inspired by Black literature, Indigenous literature, um, Jewish literature, and how they find meaning um, despite everything. You know, that famous quote by Viktor Frankl that says, "We don't. There's a pause. There's a moment between stimulus and response, and your freedom is in that moment." So that shift from reaction to response, that awareness that I can change what has happened to us or what is happening to me today, but maybe I can shift my response to it, as opposed to go on a trance and let it affect me. Um, yeah, I hope I answered the question to
Absolutely.
some degree, small degree.
Julie asks, can you talk about the inclusion of the intersex individual in the story?
Yeah, I was trying to look at a culture where sex is such a big taboo, and is so hush hush that no one ever talks about it. And at the same time, how that affects people, how that lack of access um, to the gender spectrum is going to affect a young person, whoever for the first time comes across something that she didn't know about. Maybe if she had learned about the truth of intersex people, it wouldn't have led her to, to that act of suicide. So just examining sexuality in that sense, I try to also include it in Layla's journey from someone who thought she had to be, that her body was a source of shame and sin and temptation, to someone that now allows herself to desire and to choose. I was trying to tackle sexuality in some ways. I don't know if I succeeded.
I think you did. I have a question. Well, I have two questions, two final questions. What are you working on now? What's next for you in terms of your writing, either fiction or nonfiction?
I actually recently completed another novel, and my agent is trying to find a home for it. So please wish me luck. It's the publishing business is a very difficult industry.
It is. It is.
Um, yeah. Um, and while that's been shopped around for, I have started writing another work of fiction. And in the meantime, since the protest started, I've been writing a lot of nonfiction,
Hmm.
articles and analysis on what is happening and how, other people can support them.
Excellent. And then finally, what do you like most about your writing and how you do it?
So the process of writing is really rewarding. I feel like it expands my world. It makes me go places and think about things that I wouldn't have thought about otherwise. Examining trauma, for example, um, trying to be someone else for several hours, trying to imagine being a man, trying to imagine being a person from a different culture. I think it's very liberating when I'm not myself for several hours when I write fiction. Um, and that helps me appreciate other people's experiences more, and not just be submersed and obsessed with my own experiences. So it's liberating. It's liberating to write fiction, I suppose. Sometimes when I'm really angry at someone or can't understand them, I try to write their story and see things from their perspective.
Mhm.
How
Fiction.
do I do it? Sorry.
No,
Go ahead, Roxane.
no, I was just going to say, well, that's one of my favorite things about fiction, that it can do that.
Yes, yes. And then I just cannot write if I get too busy and just don't write for a few days. I have this weird anxiety when I feel like something is missing. I haven't been able to connect with myself through writing. It feels lonely. The world suddenly feels really lonely if I can't write. I miss it, so I go back to it.
Where can we find some of your nonfiction that you've been working on, writing about the protests in Iran?
I've been pretty lousy about posting it. I should update my website, which I haven't done in a very long time. But I post on Instagram and Twitter. Some of my articles are on Instagram and Twitter. And by next week, I'll upload all of them on my website, Now Motivated.
Excellent. Well, Ava Homa, thank you so, so much. First of all, for writing Daughters of Smoke and Fire. It has been such a journey to read such a beautiful, painful, but ultimately fascinating novel, and joining us with the Audacious Book Club. And I also wanted to thank our ASL interpreters, Liel and Bob, as well as Caitlin Adams and Meg Pillow, who helped me run this book club. As you guys probably know, Literati is shutting down their adult book clubs, but we shall persevere. So the Audacious Book Club is continuing, and we will now host our discussions on Substack. So stay tuned for more details. Next month, we are reading Age of Vice by Deepti Kapoor, and we are going to be in conversation with Deepti on January 25th at a somewhat different time because the author will be in Europe. And so we will be doing it at 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific, and I hope as many of you as possible can join us. So thanks again, Ava. It's been a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much, Roxane, and everyone. I really appreciate your time.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Bye.